Okay, we're back. This should be the end of the line for us. Just a couple more minutes of lecture. I'm going to cover a few last things in the main packet we've been working from, and then time allowing, I'll probably talk about a couple of things from this guy over here. So there's a couple last ingredients that are berries that will show up in some of our soup recipes that I will probably just focus on before we finish this whole video up. Anyways, we can jump on in. Where we left off was Chanshi Uriel seeds. It's again in this 386 page, herbs that stabilize and bind. Sometimes these are called wolf nut seeds. When we look at the flavor profile, it's sweet, astringent, and neutral. Now we get the word astringent being dropped in here, right? Which means there's some kind of sour quality to it. Sweet things you imagine are probably going to tonify something, and in this case, it's qi, but then again in kind of a neutral kind of temperature way. And then the astringent quality is important here too, and we'll see how this works when we look at this first bullet point. So it says it strengthens the spleen and stops diarrhea. For chronic diarrhea caused by weakness of the transportive functions of the spleen, and it can be useful in children too. So the idea here is that the spleen qi needs to be tonified, and then the spleen also needs to be astringed. So you get both of these things in this ingredient. It's not a super strong ingredient, but it still is, very important, and so it can be used in that way. The other part with the astringing thing is it can be used to astringe the kidneys. So we saw that sour things, or in this case they're using the word astringing, can be used for the lower parts of the GI tract. It also can be used for the kidney and the two lower yin. And in this case, they're mentioning mainly things like male urogenital problems, things like nocturnal emission, premature ejaculation, spermatorrhea, and then they're also talking about urinary frequency in either gender. If we flip the page very quickly, we can see the other piece here that's interesting. It says it expels dampness. So in this case, it's good for tonifying the spleen, but also can treat dampness or damp heat. Again, it's neutral, right, in its temperature, so that can be used against either cold damp or damp heat, and that's sort of one of the positive qualities of this ingredient. Now I want to go back to the previous page where we first saw the Chanshi, and we had another little problem, the copying thing being weird. If you go on the opposite column to the Uriel, the Chanshi, there's another ingredient there that we're going to have to look at. There wasn't, again, the space at the top of the page where they list the ingredient, whatever, and again, I decided not to copy and sort of waste the page. So it says lotus seed when you look at English at the top of that opposite column to the Chanshi, and that's basically the other ingredient we need to talk about that is stabilizing and binding, or in some way astringing. So in terms of flavor profile, again, it says sweet, astringent, and neutral. We expect sweet to be tonifying of something, and again, it's going to be the spleen qi again. And then astringing is going to be handy for the same way that the Uriel seed was that we were just talking about. So really similar kind of a profile to what we just looked at. And as a matter of fact, these things are used a lot together. And you'll see Chinese recipes where they're actually used together for cooking purposes. I think when we look at the recipes, there's a few of them that are probably a little bit more important for female health. But when you get to the ones that have lotus seed and this Uriel seeds, they're probably considered maybe even a little bit more important for male urogenital health. And so there might be some little differences in terms of the recommendations of who would have which kind of recipe. That being said, there's nothing wrong with a female patient eating some recipe that has these two things in it. And conversely, when we look at the ones that are a little bit more important for female physiology, where there's astragalus and dongui, things that help to tonify qi and blood for female physiology, those things are still okay for men too. There's no downside to it, really. It's just that, they may be a little bit more important for one gender or the other. In any case, we can kind of then look at the bullet points for our lotus seed. And what does it do? Well, it's sweet, so it tonifies the spleen, and then it stops diarrhea. Why? Because it has that sour, astringent kind of a deal going on. And so that's the idea of this. And you get a lot of soups that are kind of cooked with lotus seeds. There used to be a number of places in Chicago where they would do this sort of healthy cooking thing. The trend didn't survive, which is a bit of a shame because a lot of it was good food, but it's sort of the way that you can cook they were doing in these restaurants. So they would have lots of different Chinese soup recipes, and they would use these kinds of ingredients like lotus seed and wolf nut, and they would make these kind of really great soups. And there were lots of variations with possible different health implications to it. So it was sort of a cool trend, though it didn't survive in the end. But that's essentially what we're tapping into. And I can remember, before I was doing any Chinese cooking of this type, just having these soups that had the lotus seeds in them, and I kind of liked them personally. So I wouldn't probably even strain. That is the word I was trying to come up. Last video, I think I said filter. Strain. You don't necessarily have to strain this out. I personally like the taste of it. In any case, tonifies the spleen, stops diarrhea, is good for spleen deficiency with chronic diarrhea and loss of appetite, and it can augment and bind, so it's considered to be useful. Doesn't show up in a ton of medical formulas, but for cooking purposes and in some of the formulas, it's kind of a nice ingredient. Again, we imagine the astringent thing is probably going to affect the lower jiao too, and it does again. So it says tonifies the kidney and stabilizes the essence, and that will get you again into these sort of Mayo urogenital complaints that you would expect here. Though again, this can also be useful for female patients in terms of vaginal discharge or maybe even excessive uterine bleeding. It doesn't show up in a lot of formulas for this, but again, if you're looking at like a value for certain recipes that are good for certain patients to help support what you're doing, this could be used in these sort of more gynecological problems as well. Then finally, you get an additional thing that you don't have with the qianqi, with the wolf nut, which is that it nourishes the heart and calms the spirit. So it's a little bit, again, this kind of astringing thing where you're pulling back the mind, and this will be good for things like anxiety and irritability and insomnia. And then there's also physical stuff for the heart too, like palpitations. Again, so looking at the profile in terms of flavor, our goal for this whole series of kind of conversations about these different ingredients, sweet is good to moderate the heart, and so that's helpful. And sour is good to astringe the shen, and especially when the palpitations, let's say, are involved with things that are showing symptoms of the shen, this becomes a handy ingredient. So then it says, especially useful for problems due to lack of communication between the kidneys and the heart. So that's kind of interesting. Our way of talking about kidney and heart was looking at it more in a ZZJ way, with like weak yang rising that needs to descend. We also know that we can have not enough kidney yin to control the heart fire. That's another example of a heart and kidney not communicating. And this ingredient is just even a little bit different, where it's not tonifying the yang to descend, it's not a big yin tonic, it just has this sour quality which restrains the heart fire and then allows the kidneys to sort of get a better grasping of it, and while at the same time sort of supporting the kidney in terms of the sour, protecting from loss of essence. So it's sort of an interesting ingredient from this point of view when you frame it in a heart and kidney connection. It's a little bit different than some of the other things we've looked at. All right, so that's done. If we turn to the next page, there's just a little bit here about rose hip, for what it's worth, and its flavor profile is sour, astringent, and neutral. It's not a really popular Chinese ingredient, but it does show up here and there. Again, we get the sour astringing idea. Here they're literally saying sour, so the other ingredients are a little bit more sweet. This one is, for sure sour. A lot of times when people have rose hip, they kind of flavor it in different ways to cover up the sourness. And then when we look at what it actually does, it certainly matches the profile, which is stabilizes the kidney and retains the essence, and it mentions these sort of male urogenital complaints or complaints in either gender, urinary incontinence, and then vaginal discharge for female patients. It also goes here to talk about things like prolapse of the uterus or excessive uterine bleeding, so that's kind of interesting. And then the next part about this is binding the intestines and stops diarrhea. So this is sour controlling the two lower yin. This is specifically this idea that you can have diarrhea because the spleen is weak and you get a lot of dampness. Makes sense. You can get diarrhea, I guess, because you have failure to raise even with the spleen, but some of this stuff has to do with supporting the kidney as well. So when you have things that are sour, that astringe the two lower yin, you can treat diarrhea, and that's specifically more through the kidney. And so that's where this concept sort of comes into play. You sort of learn it, and then you're not always sure when you're supposed to use it. But certainly from an ingredient point of view and a flavor profile point of view, when you have sour things that can astringe the lower jowl, then that stuff can work on the lower parts of the GI tract too. All right, next page, getting to the end of this packet. Last thing is I wanted to do something that was salty so we could see just how this works. And so I chose, it says 185 on the top, and we're choosing Haizao. So it's on the bottom of this page, but to really get to the whole thing of it, we have to flip to the very last page of the packet. And this is seaweed. So it's bitter and it's salty and it's cold. That's the flavor profile. So you expect it to treat heat. Bitter and cold things can treat heat. Salty is interesting. Salty softens. So what it does is it kind of collects and it pulls more fluids in. So there's a softening quality. So when we look at what this actually does, you get this idea of clearing heat and reducing phlegm nodules, especially in the neck, and things like goiter and scrofula or other kinds of little nodular or cystic things, I suppose, where you're trying to actually soften. That's the basic concept behind this ingredient, which makes sense from a Western point of view too. Then it says it promotes urination and reduces edema. That's using salty to kind of like stimulate the kidney. So that's one of the sort of flavor things we looked at. Of course, it says in the quotes that we looked at, if you consume too much salty, it damages the kidney. But in this case, you're using that idea as sort of a helpful kind of a way to get rid of edema. And then it says also another sort of folky thing where it's traditionally used potentially for pain associated with hernial disorder. Anyways, that's Haizao. Oops, that really shook. It's Haizao and we're done there. So that brings us to this packet, where I'll just mention a few ingredients, and if we get it out of the way now, it'll make our experience on Tuesday even a little bit easier when we look at these soups, because we'll have a lot of recipes to discuss there. So let's go into the packet, and if you just kind of get to where the ingredients start to appear, I want to look at, it'll say page 335, and there's a thing called Longyang Rou. This is dragon eye flesh in the Chinese, kind of an interesting name for a berry. And then it's just really called like longyang fruit in English, because there's not really sort of a separate name for this. So it's one of the berries. We're going to see it show up in one of our recipes, so I thought it would be good just to get it out of the way now. I really love the taste of this, and I could probably just buy it and just have it as a snack in the car and stuff like that. It is a kind of interesting thing considered for students, because it's considered to promote the spleen qi, but also sort of support the heart blood. And the idea is that students tend to run out of spleen qi and heart blood from all the concentration that's involved in memorizing and student life just in general. So kind of a handy snack for students. We bring it in from our clinic, but in general, in our clinic, it's kind of old. Ugh. And it tastes a little crunchy, and it's not really supposed to. So it kind of sits around the fridge if you don't use it, and sometimes it loses its sort of natural pliancy. It doesn't taste as good. But if you get some good Longyang Rou, it's like, I think it tastes really good, so you gotta try it for yourself and see what you think. In any case, it's sweet and warm. That means it's gonna tonify something. You probably think qi or blood, and in this case, it's a little bit of both. So it says tonifies and augments the heart and the spleen, nourishes the blood and calms the spirit. For insomnia, so let's kind of walk through this. The sweet flavor is going to tonify the spleen. Sweet flavors are also good to moderate the heart, and it's a heavier berry, so it's a little bit richer, and so it's nourishing for the blood. So if I can get more heart blood, I can get sweet to also calm the shen. I've got something that's good for treating the blood and calming the shen, while at the same time this particular fruit is sort of good in a way to treat the spleen. The trick of this is it's really like a spleen qi deficiency in the context of blood deficiency. It's not necessarily the kind of thing that you want to use for patients who have spleen qi deficiency and like diarrhea or something. Why? Because of the same thing we've been talking about. It tonifies blood. It's a heavier, more cloying berry, and so that means that it's potentially a risk to create more dampness. So you have to kind of use this with some forethought and figure out exactly what your patient needs, and then you wouldn't want to recommend it for everybody, if especially in the context of whether it might be damp. All right, so now we can kind of screen through the symptoms here. Examples here are physical symptoms of the heart, things like heart palpitations. There are more symptoms of the shen, insomnia, forgetfulness being the big things here, and then really being attributed mostly to like heart blood deficiency. And then there's also this idea that you might be dizzy, so that's kind of interesting. Commonly used for problems associated with an excess of pensiveness or overwork. That's the big idea we were talking about even with student life. You know, people who have to work hard and use their minds all the time, it's considered to be a handy berry. Again, especially if you don't have a lot of damp. If you have more damp, you have to figure out some way that you're going to deal with that damp component. I'll give some soup recipes, and there'll be an optional flavor, I suppose. I'll include it in the recipe. It has a distinctive and kind of like stronger flavor. I think it tastes really good. But then again, you know, if it's too overpowering for some people, you might not want to use it. And again, we'll maybe deal with that a little bit more on Tuesday when we look at the recipes themselves, and I'll remind about that. Okay, I have a little bit on the next page about mulberry fruit. It's sweet and cold. It's not really important in the Chinese medical literature, but it does give a different idea of a berry that's sweet and cold. And it works for our flavor profile, because things that are cold are probably, and sweet are probably going to tonify yin, and you see this here. So it tonifies blood in yin. It's kind of listed for things that are kidney deficiency type deals, dizziness, tinnitus, in this case not like a high-pitched tinnitus, but the kind of lower buzzing tinnitus for kidney deficient patients. Insomnia, maybe supporting the kidney to treat things like premature graying of the hair, for people who are showing signs of that from overwork or maybe from illness. They mentioned also constipation due to blood deficiency in the elderly, or wasting and thirsting due to yin deficiency. Remember, wasting and thirsting overall is considered a yin deficiency where the heat affects the three jiaos. So that's the basic gist of this. It's not a really important ingredient, but I just threw it in there because it's another example of a berry, and you can kind of get the idea of the flavor profile behind it. All right, I'm going to do two more things, and I'm going to say that we're done. One of them is going to the next page after the mulberry. It's yi ren. This is Chinese barley, or it says seeds of Job's tears. So it's kind of like a barley, right? And a very useful ingredient, can show up in a lot of soup recipes. We'll definitely have a recipe where this shows up. The flavor profile is sweet and bland. We haven't done a lot of bland things, so this is one where we're going to like legitimately say bland, which means you expect it to promote urination. There are other great bland things that you can cook with. I'll mention this a little bit more on Tuesday. There's a very kind of special ingredient called fuling. I don't have it in the packet here, but I'll definitely put the I'll put it up on the board so we can look at it. And it's another great bland ingredient that can be used in cooking because it has a very mild taste to it. Kind of doesn't really taste like very much at all. And it has these diuretic actions, which we're also going to see in this yi ren, or in this Chinese barley. The interesting thing about the Chinese barley too, in terms of flavor profile, sweet, bland, and also slightly cold. So it's a useful thing when there's some kind of potential damp heat involved. Of course, it's only slightly cold, so if you kind of give it with other things that are warm, it can kind of get washed out, so it won't overly damage in any way if you play it out. But you can also use it in contexts where there is actual heat, so it's sort of a useful ingredient from that point of view. This fits into a little bit what we talked about with Lidong Yuan, where there's spleen qi deficiency and damp heat that could be damaging yin. All right, so let's look at the actions then. It says promotes urination and leaches out dampness. And they mention symptoms here like edema or urinary difficulty, impaired urination. This gets into the idea of strangury. And then also what they're calling damp leg qi, that's like lower body edema. Edema is kind of an interesting question in Chinese medicine because it can come from the kidney, but it also can come from the spleen qi and damp. So this is the idea of an edema that's happening because of a spleen qi deficiency. Strengthens the spleen and stops diarrhea, so it has a mild effect in treating spleen qi deficiency with damp diarrhea. And I think the idea there is also that when you have a sweet ingredient like this, you can tonify the spleen, and then when you get rid of the dampness, you're sort of helping with that. Clears heat and expels pus. So not a big thing for us, but it can be used in combinations where you're treating things like abscesses. And that can be in the lung or in the intestines, and that's a pretty common historical usage. Again, I don't think we treat that for the most part in a food therapy point of view, but it, you know, you might show up, who knows in what context, per your private practice. I have seen people who've had like repeated abscesses, and it might be a useful thing to include an ingredient like this in a food therapy context to help support the person maybe in between abscesses, so you can kind of see it could be useful. Expels wind dampness. So this is a wind damp painful obstruction where the damp gets into the joints, and that makes total sense. And if the damp is also getting a little bit hot, well, that can be helpful too, or this ingredient can be helpful for that too. Clears damp heat, so that's what we were talking about earlier with it being slightly cold. For any damp heat disorder at any level characterized by a greasy tongue coating and digestive problems. So, you get the idea that you're going to be tonifying the spleen. That will help get rid of the damp, and you're also going to be draining the damp, and since it's cold, it can deal with the damp heat part. And then finally it mentions used in the treatment of plantar warts, which I've never done. That's again a bit more folky, but cool that maybe that's a possibility. I just never tested it personally. Okay, we got one more berry to do, and this is it. We'll be done with all of these lectures. Oh, I don't have a lot on in here. Oh, I blew it. All right. Anyways, let me point to the last page of this, and then this got clipped. So I guess what I should just say is that we'll cover this more in detail on Tuesday first, because for some reason this isn't totally here. But where it says 333, it's the very last printed page of the packet. This is where I'm finally bringing up goji berries. We've mentioned goji berries throughout the whole semester, so I'll just talk a little bit about goji berries here, and then I'll talk about it more on Tuesday. So this got clipped a little bit here. That's bad on me. Let me look at the properties though real quick. It's sweet and neutral, and it's generally considered in this case to be a blood tonic. So again, we looked at things that are sweet. They're going to be tonics of different things. The things that are more cool are yin. And then when you get to things that are neutral to warm, you get some variations here. But this, because it's a berry, it's a bit more rich, it makes sense that it would be a blood tonic. And it nourishes the blood of the liver. It's also considered to be useful for tonifying the kidney yin. And then, if we had the next page, we'd be able to see this. But the idea is that it also is kind of good for the underlying essence. So we'll talk about that more when we get to it in our recipes on Tuesday, because it'll show up in a number of recipes. It's used because it's a nice sweet berry. It's used because and so again, masks things. It's also used because it has kind of a wide range of tonifying qualities, and is good from that point of view. The downside again is that it's a berry, so it's a bit more cloying. So we'll look in the recipes how they try to hedge that. Usually that means there's going to be some kind of spleen tonic in there too, and there'll be some other warm acrid things that will help deal with some of the more cloying qualities of the berries. Anyways, that's it. We'll end on that little comment on goji berries, and then otherwise we are done. So, we're finished. We'll do the recipes on Tuesday. Thanks for watching all of this, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys when we get into class to discuss the specific recipes. Bye.